The 911 dispatcher's voice cracked through the phone line, calm yet urgent. "What's your emergency?" A terrified mother muttered, "There's a child not breathing," as her response. Responders raced to an apartment in Seaside, Oregon. Inside, they were welcomed with stillness, broken only by stifled tears. Evangelina Wing, 2 years old, was discovered unresponsive on her side in a poorly lighted bedroom. Her petite frame was covered with bruises, discoloration around her neck, and dried blood around her ears. She was already in complete rigor mortis. The physicians were troubled not just by her dead body, but also by the narrative her injuries revealed. Bite wounds, burns, and shattered bones formed a bleak picture of agony and anguish. How could anybody allow this happen to a child? Seaside, Oregon, a tranquil coastal town famed for its serene beaches, was suddenly the site of a terrible tragedy. Evangelina had lived here with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her 2 younger brothers. Dorothy, a single mother striving to care for her family, seemed to be no different from any other parent fighting to get by. But only weeks before Evangelina died, a new person entered their lives. Dorothy met Randy Roden, a guy with a troubled background, and encouraged him to move in after just a week of meeting him. Randy rapidly assumed the job of caretaker while Dorothy worked long hours. To the outside world, this seemed to be a necessity-driven collaboration, but within the apartment, an unsettling reality was taking form. At first look, Evangelina's death seemed to be an unfortunate accident. Dorothy said that her daughter had fallen over the toilet a few days ago. However, when detectives looked further, they discovered a horrific pattern of abuse that lasted months. Evangelina's murder was not an isolated occurrence. It was the result of ongoing abuse against not just her, but also her 2 brothers. This was more than just one act of violence. It was the narrative of systematic failure, deception, and terrible brutality that transformed a once-loving household into a house of horrors. What happened would be remembered as one of the most disturbing child abuse instances in Clatsop County history, leaving a community broken and seeking for answers. Hello and welcome to Unseen True Crime Stories HQ. I appreciate you, my viewers, and particularly my subscribers, for your continued support as we strive to improve and offer you new and untold real crime tales every day. Please do not forget to subscribe to this channel. So let's get started. Evangelina Wing, born on January 22, 2011, was the kind of youngster who could light up a room with her grin. She had huge, inquiring eyes and a giggle that made everyone like her. Evangelina's universe was tiny but full of affection, focused on her siblings. A 5-year-old brother who loved her and a younger brother who matched her insatiable enthusiasm. The 3 youngsters were a close-knit trio, and their laughing could frequently be heard throughout the tiny apartment they shared in Seaside, Oregon. Their mother, Dorothy Wing, worked valiantly to provide for children. As a single mom, she juggled grueling hours and minimal finances, yet she never let her children feel unwanted. But behind the surface, fissures in the family's delicate equilibrium began to appear. Dorothy was fatigued. Juggling work and parenting on her own had taken its toll. And although she masked it well, those closest to her knew she craved company, someone to share the load of raising her children. In the autumn of 2014, Dorothy met Randy Roden. Their paths intersected unexpectedly, and Dorothy regarded Randy as a beacon of hope. He was attractive, attentive, and seemed willing to take on the role of a father figure for her children. Randy's attention seemed like a lifeline to a lady who had been navigating the murky seas of single parenthood on her own. But Dorothy was unaware of, or maybe chose not to perceive, the darkness behind Randy's surface. Randy Roden's background was filled with violence and domination. His criminal record includes charges for domestic violence, sexual assault, and abduction. He had a history of deceiving and assaulting women, resulting in a path of destroyed lives. However, he had a knack of concealing his real character by portraying himself as the answer to his suffering single mother's prayers. Randy moved into Dorothy's little flat less than a week after they met. It was a rash choice that sparked suspicion among neighbors, but Dorothy seemed determined to make it work. She told friends that Randy made her feel protected, that he was terrific with the kids, and that maybe, just maybe, things were finally looking up for her family. Randy wasted little time integrating into the family's everyday routine. Dorothy worked hard hours to make ends meet, so he rapidly became the main caretaker. At first, it seemed like a godsend, so Dorothy started to depend on him, taking solace in the fact that she wasn't alone anymore. But Randy's assistance came with strings attached. He began making choices without consulting Dorothy, therefore establishing authority over the home. His passion erupted at the slightest inconvenience, but he was careful to channel his rage when Dorothy was not there. The youngsters, who were before carefree and full of life, started to retreat. Initially, the alterations were modest. Neighbors remarked that the youngsters, who were formerly so active, were now seldom seen playing outdoors. When they did step outside, there were signs of trouble, a bruise on Evangelina's arm, and the 5-year-old walked with a limp. When questioned, Dorothy dismissed concerns, claiming that the children were just clumsy. Inside the flat, the evidence of neglect and abuse were becoming more obvious. Dorothy and Randy's arguments got louder, pouring through the building's thin walls. The once warm and inviting environment was transformed into one of dread and control. Evangelina, the energetic young girl who used to dance to music in the living room, became silent. She clutched to her siblings, her joy giving way to a terrified quiet. Her brothers, who were too little to properly comprehend what was going on, started to endure the bodily consequences of Randy's presence. By December 2014, the tragedy that had been building inside the Wing family had reached a breaking point. Evangelina's brightness was waning, and the bruises could no longer be explained away. The events that followed would reveal the awful truth of life within that flat, leaving a community wondering how it had gotten to this point. The facts of the abuse are truly astounding and horrible. Evangelina's once smooth, silky skin has become a patchwork of bruises, cuts, and discoloration. The medical examiner subsequently described the injuries as darkening around her neck, which indicated strangling, blood collecting in her earlobes, and bite marks on all of her small fingers. She was missing a fingernail on each hand, which might have been caused by acute trauma or long-term maltreatment. Her left arm, shattered from shoulder to wrist, was carelessly wrapped in an ace bandage. Under the bandage, the humerus bone had twisted into a spiral fracture, which specialists ascribed to someone forcibly tugging and twisting her arm. Seriously, who would do this to a child? But the nightmare did not end there. Randy's fury also fell on Evangelina's brothers. Her 5-year-old brother was discovered with severe bruises all over his body, healing burns on his ears and nose, and a shattered pelvis, an injury uncommon even in high-impact trauma cases. His head was covered with sores, and both of his eyes were swelled shut from internal bleeding, which medical specialists said was consistent with direct strikes to the face. The 2-year-old brother also had serious injuries, including many bruises, swelling on his face, and a puncture hole inside his mouth that allowed air to enter the tissue of his jaw. His injuries revealed a frightening picture of planned, continuous brutality. The children's stories provide further light on the terror they experienced. When questioned by authorities, the 5-year-old reported being tied like a dog inside the residence. The shackles left raw bruises on his wrists and ankles, and the boys described being trapped in their chamber for hours, sometimes days, with no food or drink. Randy's tactics were not only harsh, but also premeditated, with the goal of physically and emotionally breaking the children. Honestly, no kid should ever have to go through this. It's cruel, and one of the worst examples possible. The apartment itself mirrored the terror within. Toys were abandoned in corners, neglected and forgotten. The air had a foul stink of neglect, unclean clothing, rotten food, and the lingering scent of terror. The walls seemed to absorb the children's screams, obscuring Randy's authority. Evangelina, formerly a happy and energetic child, started to dwindle. She stopped dancing and laughing. Her sparkling eyes, once filled with inquiry, now seemed hollow, reflecting the weight of her pain. She clung to her siblings, taking consolation in their shared misery. But even their link couldn't keep her safe from the growing torture. While Randy's harshness caused bodily harm, Dorothy's inactivity solidified her involvement in the disaster. Dorothy may have first trusted Randy's explanations. The bruising were accidental, and the burns were the result of careless play. But when the damage got too severe to overlook, her quiet became deafening. Dorothy's history showed a lady battling her own issues. As a single mother, she was overwhelmed by the duties of parenting 3 children alone. Randy entered her life like a lifeline, providing the assistance she so sorely needed. But his assistance came at a cost. He immediately took control, manipulating Dorothy with a mix of charm and intimidation. In imagined inner monologues, Dorothy may have struggled with her shame and fear. This isn't right, but what can I do? I can't do this alone. Do the kids need a father figure? Randy's influence drained her confidence, leaving her immobilized and unable to act. Neighbors sometimes overheard conflicts via the thin apartment walls. Randy's voice would erupt, followed by Dorothy's quiet objections. But these moments of resistance were fleeting. Dorothy's fear of Randy, or maybe her own denial, kept her involved. She let Randy chastise the kids, disregarded their pleas, and turned a blind eye to their injuries. Dorothy failed to protect her children when they most needed her, whether due to fear, dependence, or apathy. By December 2014, Evangelina's little body had given up. She had grown more sluggish, her energies depleted by the constant abuse. Her injuries made it difficult for her to move and play with her siblings. Her hunger had dwindled, and she spent the most of her time laying down, unable to gather the strength to interact with the world around her. On December 19, 2014, Evangelina was clearly sick. She didn't have the energy to eat or play. Dorothy observed, but did nothing, perhaps dismissing her symptoms as fatigue or a little sickness. Randy, as usual, was disdainful. He dismissed Dorothy's fears and told her to let Evangelina rest. That night, Dorothy put Evangelina to bed in her room. Dorothy discovered her daughter unconscious in the early morning hours of December 20th, 2014. Evangelina's little body was chilly and rigid, her face bruised and discolored. Dorothy dialed 911, her voice shaking with panic. "My daughter isn't breathing." When emergency personnel arrived, they were confronted with a spectacle that would haunt them forever. Evangelina's dead corpse lying on her side, wounded and battered, in complete rigor mortis. The outward evidence of abuse revealed a history of ongoing assault, neglect, and misery. As detectives started to put together the facts, it became evident that Evangelina's death was not a terrible accident, but rather the consequence of months of unspeakable brutality. This amount of suffering and brutality may bring anybody to tears, eliciting both profound empathy and fervent rage against all forms of child abuse. But the horror did not stop there. In another room, 2 little boys sat quietly on a shabby mattress. Their eyes, once brilliant with the innocence of infancy, now looked blankly into space. The 5-year-old's face was severely swelled, and his eyes were almost closed due to internal hemorrhaging. His ears and nose were burnt, and his pelvis had been broken, which physicians subsequently described as a horrifyingly unusual injury in youngsters. The 2-year-old, little more than a newborn, had bruises all over his body and a puncture wound in his mouth, proof of horrible violence. Responders swiftly recognized the risk these youngsters were still in. The youngsters were promptly evacuated from their residence and sent to Randall Children's Hospital for medical assessments. Meanwhile, Dorothy and Randy were arrested. Dorothy seemed dazed, with a combination of terror and remorse flashing over her face. Randy, on the other hand, showed no remorse, his demeanor chilly and unconcerned, as if it were just another day. The authorities realized they were dealing with more than just a horrible accident. Here was the face of intentional, meticulous abuse, a reality much worse than they had anticipated. The inquiry started in earnest, with Evangelina's autopsy providing light on the atrocities she had experienced. The medical examiner methodically documented her injuries, each one a stunning indication of months of mistreatment. The fatality resulted from blunt force injuries to the head. Her little skull exhibited symptoms of hemorrhage, and her brain swelled, indicating a severe concussion. These injuries were not just recent. They were committed with terrible, purposeful force. What had she done to deserve this? Even adults cannot withstand this kind of suffering, and the worst examples of torture in jail pale in comparison. Evangelina's left arm had been twisted into a spiral fracture, which experts said could only happen if someone forcibly wrenched and twisted her arm. The adult-sized bite scars on her fingers were horrible proof of the merciless anguish she had endured. Her fingernails were pulled off her hands, revealing raw, delicate skin underneath. The examination also found discoloration around her neck and damaged capillaries in her eyes, indicating that she had been strangled at some time. Her body was a map of pain, with bruises, lacerations, and scars in different states of healing. This was not a one-time act of violence. It was persistent torture. Her siblings' assessments were similarly awful. The 5-year-old had a shattered pelvis, burns to his nose and ears, and scalp lesions. His face was swollen and bruised, and his eyes had been injured by repeated strikes. The 2-year-old had a puncture hole in his mouth, bruises on his face and chest, and previous injuries that had not been addressed. The medical experts at Randall Youngsters' hospital agreed that these youngsters had been living in misery. With the evidence increasing, the police shifted their attention to Dorothy and Randy. Dorothy was charged with homicide and criminal mistreatment, with her inactivity seen as cooperation in the abuse. Randy faced allegations of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal abuse. Search warrants discovered further proof of the abuse. Blood stains were discovered on clothes, and neighbors reported hearing cries and screaming from the flat. Investigators also discovered shackles used by Randy to confine the youngsters, which confirmed the boys' claims of being chained like dogs. Dorothy's interviews depicted a woman damaged by manipulation and terror. She acknowledged to observing the injuries, but said she felt helpless to intervene. "I didn't know what to do," she informed officers. However, when confronted with irrefutable proof of her inability to safeguard her children, the justifications fell flat. The discovery of Evangelina's corpse and forensic evidence signaled the start of a case that would stun the country. The line catches powerful emotion, but may be adjusted for clarity and effect. But as the court struggle approached, one concern stayed in everyone's minds. What punishment could these monsters masquerading as people really deserve? In court, the prosecution presented a terrible scenario. Randy Roden, they contended, was more than just a substandard caretaker. He was the mastermind behind unspeakable brutality. They portrayed him as a cunning, vicious monster who preyed on a defenseless family, leaving a path of physical and emotional destruction in his wake. The chronology of events was clear and irrefutable. The prosecution made a clear distinction between the children's life before and after Randy came in. Photos of Evangelina and her siblings taken in the summer of 2014 revealed healthy, happy children. Evangelina with her broad grin and brilliant eyes, and her brothers laughing and carefree. The photographs, however, altered once Randy joined their life in October. The bruises began little and gradually grew. Evangelina's radiance faded as her ailments worsened, ending in her untimely death in December. Evangelina didn't just fall off a toilet, the prosecutor said, their voice quivering with restraint. She was tortured. Photographs of Evangelina's bruises, bite scars, and missing fingernails were shown to the jury as proof that she had been subjected to deliberate assault rather than neglect. Witness after witness took the stand to support the evidence. Neighbors said that they heard yelling and weeping coming from the wing apartment. The prosecution did not stop with the children's injuries. They also investigated Randy's background, revealing a pattern of domestic abuse, manipulation, and control. Court documents showed a guy who had frequently hurt women and children, a predator who hid behind charm and seemed to care. The evidence was undeniable. However, Randy's defense team chose a different tactic that seemed almost desperate in the face of such overwhelming evidence. They claimed that Evangelina died as a result of an undiscovered staph infection that led to sepsis rather than mistreatment. A pediatric forensic pathologist testified for the defense, alleging that the bacterial infection had moved into Evangelina's circulation, causing organ failure. They proposed that the obvious lesions on her body, such as bite marks and bruises, may have been indicators of an illness rather than evidence of maltreatment. However, the defense's approach went farther. They intended to completely put the responsibility upon Dorothy. Randy's counsel painted her as a manipulative, irresponsible mother who had a history of abusing her children even before Randy came. These showed photos of the children with minor injuries, saying these were proof of Dorothy's maltreatment. Randy, they maintained, was only attempting to assist a struggling mother in keeping her family together. The defense also questioned the prosecution's use of forensic odontology. They stated that the bite mark evidence pointing to Randy was untrustworthy and had not been properly confirmed. They probed the prosecution's expert on why certain tests had not been conducted, hoping to raise doubts in the jury's minds. However, as strong as their arguments were on paper, they collapsed in the face of the prosecution's crushing evidence. The injuries were too serious and particular to be explained away by infection or chance. The trial was a whirlwind of emotions. Medical specialists and detectives talked in measured tones, their professionalism hardly hiding their pain. One physician stopped to compose herself while explaining the degree of the children's injuries, her voice cracking as she recounted the spiral fracture in Evangelina's arm. The jury was noticeably shocked. Several members looked away when grisly images of Evangelina's corpse were shown on screens in the courtroom. Others wiped away tears as they listened to recordings of the 5-year-old kid explaining how he and his siblings were tied like dogs in their house. However, after weeks of testimony, the jury made their conclusion. Randy Roden was convicted of murder, manslaughter, assault, and criminal mistreatment. The penalty was severe, 40 years in jail. But the narrative did not stop there. Randy's defense team challenged his conviction years later, claiming that the prosecution's bite mark evidence was scientifically invalid. To the community's indignation, the Oregon Court of Appeals lowered Randy's sentence to just 20 years, leaving many feeling that justice had been denied. Dorothy, who had reached a plea agreement with prosecutors, pled guilty to homicide and criminal abuse. She obtained a 15-year term in return for her testimony against Randy. While some considered her punishment mild, considering her part in the children's misery, others regarded it as a necessary compromise to achieve Randy's conviction. When the specifics of Evangelina Wing's case became public, the town of Seaside, Oregon, was shocked and enraged. Neighbors who had observed the youngsters playing outdoors felt guilty, as if they had overlooked the warning signals. Randy Roden's first sentence of 40 years offered some relief, but when it was lowered to 20 years after an appeal, the indignation resurfaced. How could the court allow this to happen? One neighbor mourned. He tormented those children, and now he may walk out of jail in only 2 decades. Legal experts challenged the reliance on bite mark evidence, which was a key element of the appeal. According to one expert, this instance demonstrates a systemic flaw with how we handle forensic evidence. But this should not conceal the overwhelming evidence of abuse. Dorothy Wing's plea agreement, in which she received 15 years in return for her testimony, was similarly divisive. Some considered it as a necessary concession to achieve Randy's conviction, while others saw it as disrespectful to Evangelina's memory. One protester claimed during a neighborhood gathering that 15 years is insufficient punishment for a mother who saw her children be tortured. The case sparked debates about justice, responsibility, and the shortcomings that enabled the abuse to go unchecked. On the other side, several legal experts contended that Dorothy's punishment was justified given her pressured and controlled situation. One criminal psychologist observed that victims of manipulation often feel helpless to act. Dorothy's participation in this tragedy illustrates both her personal shortcoming and the system's inability to act. This case sparked ethical debates concerning plea bargaining in situations of child abuse. Is it worthwhile to reduce a sentence if it helps bring a criminal to justice, or does it diminish the gravity of the crimes committed? The absence of a clear explanation only fueled the displeasure over the case's conclusion. Evangelina's brothers, ages 2 and 5 at the time of her death, were taken into protective custody after being removed from their mother's care. The physical scars from their maltreatment started to heal, but the mental traumas remained deep. The lads later moved to California. According to reports, they had considerable treatment to help them cope with their tragedy. A child psychologist who dealt with the boys praised their resilience. They've been through unspeakable anguish, but they've shown great strength. They're gradually understanding what it means to feel protected and cherished. While their lives have improved, the shadow of their past persists. Advocates have used their narrative to advocate for improved support systems for child abuse survivors, highlighting the value of long-term care and stability. The case of Evangelina Wing exposed apparent institutional flaws that led to her death. One of the most significant concerns was Randy Roden's lack of control in the past. Despite his history of domestic violence and probation breaches, he was able to move into Dorothy's house without raising any concerns. Child Protective Services had no previous interaction with the family, exposing the youngsters to unregulated abuse. This was a failure at every level, said one child welfare advocate. From probation officials to neighbors to the court system, there were several chances to intercede, but none were taken. The case also highlighted the need for tougher background checks and more comprehensive training for individuals who deal with vulnerable families. Activists advocated for improvements to guarantee that no kid falls between the gaps again. Evangelina's life was brutally cut short, but her narrative has made a lasting impression on those who heard it. She was a small girl who enjoyed laughing, playing with her brothers, and finding pleasure in the simplest of things. Her death is a depressing reminder of how easily innocence can be lost when society turns a blind eye. Evangelina's tale is one we should never forget. Her suffering should serve as a wake-up call for all of us to stay watchful, speak out, and defend those who cannot protect themselves. How many more youngsters must suffer? Every kid needs a secure and loving environment. Yet for far too many, their homes, which are supposed to protect them, become the source of terrible misery. The statistics surrounding child abuse are both startling and frightening. Let's take a deeper look at the numbers that show the full scale of the situation. In 2022, approximately 558,000 children in the United States were confirmed victims of abuse and neglect. That's approximately 8 out of every 1,000 youngsters. The most prevalent kind of abuse is neglect. It impacts a staggering 74.3% of victims. Physical and sexual abuse follow, but neglect typically prepares the way for more serious, long-term injury. These figures are more than simply statistics. They represent actual children. Each instance has a narrative of trauma that may have been avoided. The deaths caused by child maltreatment are the most terrible realities. In 2021, an estimated 1,820 children perished as a result of abuse and neglect. That is 5 children every day. Each was a life full of possibilities, hopes dashed because no one intervened in time. Detecting child abuse at an early stage is one of the most difficult obstacles in dealing with it. In 2022, there were over 4.3 million referrals to Child Protective Services, affecting 7.5 million children. 3 million youngsters got investigations or alternate replies. Despite these efforts, numerous incidents remain undiscovered, trapping vulnerable youngsters in perilous situations. The wounds of abuse do not vanish after the abuse has ended. For many survivors, the impacts last a lifetime. According to studies, children who have experienced abuse or neglect are 9 times more likely to engage in criminal action later in life. Approximately 80% of 21-year-olds who were mistreated as children suffer from at least one psychiatric condition. Consider this: 8 out of 10 young individuals carry the unseen burden of their trauma into adulthood. These statistics depict a bleak image, but they are more than simply data. They are a call to action. The issue is, what can we do to modify the outcomes? Together, we can transform these tragic statistics into tales of hope, rehabilitation, and prevention. Every number we've provided reflects a child's life that required someone to notice, care about, and act. Let us remember those who were failed by the system, and let their experiences inspire us to never let it happen again. And thus we come to the end of this unsettling narrative, one filled with lost innocence, unspeakable brutality, and lingering concerns about justice. The terrible story of Evangelina Wing challenges us to face the worst parts of human nature while also focusing on the structural flaws that enabled this to occur. Justice was delivered in court, but given the lenient punishments and the permanent wounds inflicted on Evangelina's surviving brothers, can any penalty possibly compare to the atrocities faced by these children? How can we, as a society, guarantee that no kid falls between the gaps again? What might neighbors or community members have done differently to help avoid this tragedy? Do you believe systemic improvements, such as tougher background checks or improved child welfare processes, would make a difference? How can we, as people, be watchful for indicators of child abuse and respond when necessary? We would love to hear your ideas and comments. In these critical discussions, your opinion is vital. While you're here, be sure to check out our other videos, like and subscribe to help support our channel, and join us in bringing light on tales that should never be forgotten.